Yeah.
Let's go.
Car behind, but
Car behind.
but it is waiting for us. So
We have to go.
yeah, we go.
I go.
Only 57.